Hello, everyone. So it is really my great pleasure to have with us today Panayis Fourniotis from Qualco. And the timing, I think, is perfect because the collaboration with Qualco, between Qualco and our laboratory has started a few weeks ago and was officially announced. And this is something that we're really very happy about. And so Panayis will give us a brief overview of what Qualco's interest in AI is, and part of that will also form our common collaboration in the next few years. So Panayis, the floor is yours.
So hello, everybody. I'm Panayis Fourniotis. I work for Qualco, and I'm here to talk to you about my experience in using AI to optimize credit management operations. And don't worry if you don't know what that means, I'll explain. But first, let me give you some context for this talk, because it does mention AI in the title. But AI or machine learning or data science, predictive modeling, all of these wonderful new overlapping techniques that go by different names depending on the fashion of the year. For us, they all fall under the umbrella of contemporary analytics, and they're all techniques. They're a set of techniques that promise to optimize our operations, let us run our business better. Okay, but there's a slight issue there, a slight misunderstanding, because operations, businesses, they don't run on techniques; they run on processes. So a number of questions start to come up. Where do these techniques fit into our processes? How can we get them to deliver on the promise of optimizing our operations? I'm going to share a few lessons that I and my team learned in setting up debt servicing operations informed by prescriptive analytics. What it means is helping people who manage loan portfolios to do their job better. First, a bit of background. Qualco, the company that I work for, is an end-to-end technology and services provider for the credit sector. So it focuses on providing solutions for managing loans, and it especially focuses on the sad end of the credit life cycle, non-performing exposures, receivables, and so on. We work with multiple banks and debt servicers in Europe and beyond. We are based here in Greece. Greece is a very conservative market as far as the credit sector is concerned. It has lots of regulation and, unfortunately, lots of debt. My personal background is in building technology products, and for the past almost 10 years, I've been working with AI and the wider world around AI for treatment workflow optimization. So basically trying to get businesses to do their job better. So my takeaways are colored by my experience, but I will be happy to discuss yours afterwards if I manage to leave enough time for a Q&A. So I mentioned analytics and I mentioned process. What is this analytics process? For us, and I think that most people would agree, analytics is the process that starts with data and ends with better business decisions. It's a simple, linear, reasonable process. It always starts with the data. It does interesting things to the data. It shows you the data in interesting ways. It derives logic and correlations and predictive models from the data. And ultimately, it suggests decisions. It suggests actions to be taken in order to optimize the performance of your business. If we're talking about the credit sector, that's optimizing the performance of your loan portfolio. Okay, what's new about this? Well, there's one easy answer, which is that nothing is new about this. You can introduce AI or data science or whatever somewhere within this process, but the truth is that the process has been in place for a while, since at least the 1950s. And AI and ML or whatever you want to call it, it's just analytics with bells on. So why the fuss about AI? That's because of another easy answer, which is that everything is new about this, because we may still be following the same process, but the techniques involved in it are now radically different. We use more data, or big data as it's called. We may use more types of data, including text and even speech data. We aim to expend less human effort fewer people manually moving numbers around. We aim to discover more hidden patterns. And the holy grail, the ultimate goal, is to do ubiquitous analytics, apply analytics everywhere and affect and improve every treatment decision, which is something that additional analytics just did not have the scale to do. Okay, but what changes? What do we need to do to take advantage of these changes? First of all, we need to clarify our approach and our expectations. People tend to say, "Oh, great, let's do AI." It's not as simple as that. You need to think about four main things: scope, gaps, pain points, and the risk appetite. And what's more, people are used to thinking about these things in the context of business processes. You also need to think about them in terms of the analytics process. Also, you need to really resist being seduced by the technology. Most people who try to do analytics for the first time will find that their pain points are on the first line or on the last line I showed in the previous slide. There are pain points in descriptive analytics or data management. There are pain points in operationalizing analytics. If your pain points are not on the middle line, which is all about predictive and prescriptive analytics, guess what? AI will not help because AI lives on the middle line. And if you've just decided to do AI because it's fashionable, because it has promise, because you believe in the technology, well, that may not be wrong, but you're thinking about techniques. And if you're not thinking about the process, you won't improve any process at all. I've reached, I think, slide 7 already, and I've been talking theoretically. So let me try to make things a bit more concrete by introducing a case study, an actual problem that we try to solve for one of our clients. Throughout the talk, I will be talking about how these ideas and these recommendations apply to this case study and how far they got us. Case studies, the way we present them, are usually people like us working for technology providers. We tend to think about solutions. So case studies are all about solutions, probably solutions that we're trying to persuade you to buy that are supposed to solve problems. But let's try to do it the right way and look at the problem first and consider the solution later. Okay, what is the problem? What is the business process we're trying to improve? It's an actual problem that one of our clients came up with. Remember the 4 questions. Scope. The scope is indebted customers, people who owe money. In this particular case, it's people who owe money, but they have already negotiated a payment arrangement and they are slowly repaying their debt. Despite that fact, some of them will not stick to the payment arrangement. Some of them are going to break it. The question is how we can treat each of those customers, both the ones who are likely to break their payment arrangement and the rest, in the fairest and most effective way. You'll notice that I say fairest and most effective. Many people think that fairness and effectiveness are in conflict in credit operations. By the end of this talk, I hope to give you a few arguments about why that is not the case. Second issue, gaps. What are our gaps? Well, so far our client had been applying uniform treatment, no matter what the characteristics of the customer or their risk level or their individual circumstances. They would treat everybody the same. If they were likely to break a payment arrangement, they would call them and ask them to please pay. What we're trying to do here is move from uniform treatment to targeted treatment. And that is our main business gap. We need to find a way to identify the right sort of treatment for every customer. Pain points. Well, those are related to the gaps because the reason we haven't been doing targeted treatment so far is that our client doesn't know who the higher risk customers are. And even if they did, they have no idea how to differentiate their treatment. And the risk appetite, remember I mentioned that the credit sector is very conservative, especially here in Greece. There is very little risk appetite. People feel that they can't change things because they can't afford to reduce cash inflows or increase effort or risk anything breaking. And that's a key insight because you know the stereotypes about credit people, about bankers, essentially, that they're greedy. The unfairness that happens around the credit life cycle is not due to greed. It's due to the perception of risk. It's not that people don't know how to be more fair. It's that they are afraid to change anything, to make any innovative changes that will improve fairness and therefore effectiveness, for fear of breaking things. And that is something that we will have to overcome. Okay, that was the business process. That was the problem. What about the solution, which we hope to come through our analytics process? Again, we need to think about the same points. Scope. The scope here is to apply prescriptive analytics based on AI-driven predictive modeling. Gaps. In the context of prescriptive analytics, there are always two big gaps. The first is to get from data to predictions. But the next one is to get from predictions to decisions and suggested actions. These are not the same problem. They're two separate problems, and we need to address each in turn. Pain points. I won't bore you with the technical pain points. There are quite a lot of them. And yes, remember what I mentioned earlier, most of them are indeed on the top and the bottom lines of the analytics process. AI itself is not that hard if you've solved data management and operationalization. But you know, that may be a good thing, but it's also a bad thing because it means that AI will not help you solve your hardest problems. Risk appetite. There's lots of technical risk appetite. Even our client was very willing to try out new technologies and approaches because, to be honest, they were doing uniform treatment. Nothing can be worse than that. Any benefit you can gain by differentiating treatment is for free, as long as it doesn't disrupt the business, and that is a major constraint. In fact, it's not the only constraint, as we'll see later on, because even though people will tell you they have lots of technical risk appetite, that may turn out not to be the case. So we've talked about the analytics process. We talked about the business process. I've shown you the analytics process. Let me now show you the business process. It looks like this. Remember the analytics process? Linear, simple, reasonable, not always easy to get through, but easy to talk about. Operations processes are never easy to talk about. Their complexity is an order of magnitude greater than that of the analytics process. See the little rhombus-like shapes here. Each one of those is a decision point. Even deciding what you want to decide and what you want to optimize is an issue. But I'll try to get back to that later on. Next question. Who wants this? Who wants to do AI? Who wants to use analytics to optimize the business? And again, there is one simple answer, which is that everybody wants this. It's new, it's cool, it promises to change the world. But what exactly do they want it for? When you ask that, the answers you get are a bit fuzzier. And that is because there is another easy answer, which is that nobody really wants this, especially in the credit sector. It's new, therefore it's scary, it's risky. There's not much that you can compare it to, so it's not very easy to evaluate, and it antagonizes people. There are people who have been trying to optimize the treatment of their portfolios in more traditional ways, doing completely empirical analytics or just by trial and error. And those people will feel threatened by any new idea because, unfortunately, even though these new ideas would just give them a chance to do their job better, they tend to focus on questions like, why haven't I been doing my job better in the past? And that, that scares them and it generates a lot of resistance. So what do we recommend? First of all, you need to find your sponsors. Everybody knows that to run a new initiative as part of a business plan, you need at least an executive sponsor, somebody at the top of the organization who will say, yes, I want to do this and I am willing to spend money to do it. What most people don't realize is that an executive sponsor is not enough. You also need a line of business champion, someone much closer to the day-to-day running of the business, who has a personal stake in the success of this initiative, because it will make their personal experience better. It will make their working life better. It will make their job easier. And And furthermore, these two have to be different people. So you need two sponsors, not two in one. I have seen organizations where the CEO is also the same person who writes the code to run the analytics initiative. That can work, but most likely it will not. Once you found your sponsors, you need to determine their priorities. And those priorities should align with the priorities of the business. They won't always do so. If they don't, you need to ask why. Because you've either got the wrong sponsors who don't understand what the priorities of the business are, or the priorities of the business are not what they have been stated to be. In either case, you need to resolve this. And whatever the priorities are, you need to know what they are. Do they want to make more money? One thing that was surprising to me coming from a technology background was that not all businesses want to make more money. Do they want to keep their customers happy? Do they want to keep their investors or their stockholders happy? That is not necessarily the same thing as making more money. And also, in the end, many of them may just be trying to justify earlier choices, using new techniques to prove that they've been right all along. And that is another issue that you may have to deal with. Once you have all of that, you need to decide what your analytics organizational structure looks like and what resources you can use. There are many choices here. Do you build a centralized analytics hub, or do you embed the little analytics teams in every line of business unit? Do you have a separate innovation unit to deal with the new techniques, AI, ML, whatever? Or do you make it part of the operational analytics teams? Are you going to focus on technology or on business knowledge, or a little bit of both? How much do you want the operations teams to be represented within analytics? There is no right answer to all of this. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on organizational culture. It depends on the problems you're trying to solve. But once you've set it up, it's very hard to change going forward. So you have to get it right to begin with. What does all of this mean in terms of our case study? Well, in our case, executive buy-in was easy. We had a CEO in place who really wanted to try this out. But finding a line of business champion was hard. And that's not because there weren't suitable people in the organization. It's because the organization had a baroque management structure that meant all of the suitable people were 4 layers away from us. This is one of the things that we didn't realize early on. And it turns out, surprise, surprise, that access to the line of business is critical in the day-to-day running of an analytics initiative. It's critical for reconciliation, for interpreting the results, for agreeing on what the story is, for doing adjustments and optimization as the initiative progresses. You need to be able to talk to your champion. And if talking to your champion means you have to go through 4 layers of different teams that communicate through weekly meetings, it can take up to 2 months for an answer to come back. Priorities. We were assuming that the business wanted to make more money, spend less effort, and be more fair. On the other hand, they assumed that the ad hoc initiatives that they had been running would be supported by our analysis, or at least would be compatible with it. Well, we all know what they say about assumption. Assumption is the mother of all mess ups, let me put it politely. Our organizational structure, which is having analytics as an independent general purpose function, helped us to exploit our experience and identify this priority mismatch early on. But it would have been even better if that mismatch hadn't happened in the first place. On the other hand, a centralized and more technical organizational structure means it can be hard to communicate priorities that are of no concern to operations. Remember about the pain points, mostly technical pain points that have to do with data management, data quality, data consistency. If you talk to the business about them, they'll say, it's not my concern, talk to IT. And the problem won't get solved. So in practice, it would have been useful, again, in retrospect, to have an analytics ambassador embedded in operations, someone who could explain analytics concerns to the people running the business. Okay, having resolved all of that, what's the next question? Where do we start? The beginning of analytics is always data. Remember, analytics is the process of using data to reach better business decisions. We need to start with the data. And It may be obvious that the data we need depend on the problems that we want to solve. What may not be obvious to everybody is that you need a structured way of obtaining and persisting the data and verifying it and disseminating it to everybody who needs to consume it. And you also need a consistent way of reporting on your data and matching the operational reports against your analytics initiatives. Because if the data that the business sees on operational reports does not reflect the improvements that your analytics initiatives deliver, then they won't be persuaded that the analytics initiatives have achieved anything. So these are not just technical concerns. They are fundamental preconditions of success for any AI-driven initiative. What should you do about it? Well, the first part is pretty obvious. You need to build a data repository. Building data repositories is boring, and many people try to skip this step. You won't get anywhere if you skip this step. You need to bring all of your data together and use your data repository as a single source of truth. Also, don't be surprised, or rather you will be surprised by the resistance you will encounter. It might sound reasonable that having a single source of truth for all reporting and analytics would be a good thing for everybody. It's not, because people tend to have their own personal versions of the truth, and when they try to reconcile them with other people's, conflicts happen. Look at your data pain points. Again, what are your problems with in dealing with the data? Is it response time? Is it reliability, accessibility? You need to solve all of these before you try to do AI. Again, remember, all of these problems live on the top line, data management and descriptive analytics. You won't be able to solve them using AI. You have to solve them in order to be able to do AI. And also, and this may be a bit less obvious, it's not enough to have a data repository. You also need to have a data roadmap that explains how your data repository is going to evolve. You need to include all of the data that you will need for the problems that you eventually want to address. One thing that we've seen happen very often in analytics is that you start considering an analysis and you quickly realize that the data you need to run the analysis is not in your data repository, and it will take 3 to 6 months to accumulate enough data once you make the corresponding configuration change. So try to avoid that by looking ahead and putting all of the data that you will need on your data roadmap. You also need to encourage, or rather enforce, regulatory compliance and data governance. Here in Europe, aka the civilized world, we have things like GDPR, and there are very good reasons why we have them. The fact that you have access to some data doesn't mean that you should use it. And there are very clear rules about what you can and cannot do, and you need to have a mechanism to enforce those rules, as well as any changes to your business practices around data management. What does that mean for our case study? Well, in our case, we were lucky. Being Qualco, we had one of our products in place at the client, and that product does provide a data repository with end-to-end data tracking, which meant that we knew what data we had available, we knew where it came from, we could always explain what the data represented. The problem was that the client was not using this data repository for reporting, and that led to various issues. I'm not going to bore you with the technical issues. Tech stuff is easy, but there were also business issues. We could tell where the data came from, but what it represented was another matter. And typically you would use your business champions to quickly answer questions like that. But remember, 4 weeks to get the question there and another 4 to get the answer back. That didn't work very well. You also get philosophical issues. Again, everybody's favorite response to data issues is yes, but. Yes, but my part of the portfolio is different. Yes, but your analysis does not apply in my case. Yes, but anything to ignore the truth rather than deal with the consequences. And again, that's something that you need to deal with before you start with your analysis. Another point related to this is that having your data repository, you also need to have the right reports to report on what your analytics initiative will be doing. And that turned out to be a much, much harder problem than we had anticipated. In fact, building a right report to prove the effectiveness of our analytics initiative took longer than everything else put together. This is not obvious. It's something that I wish I knew before we started this case study. Try to keep it in mind if you start something of your own. Building a data roadmap. Well, we really try to push the client to build a data roadmap, but the truth is not nobody cares about new data until they do. They don't care about the data they need to collect in the future. They only care about the data they should have been collecting for the past 6 months, but they haven't been doing so. One way to approach this is to forget about analytics entirely and hook up with operations projects, the projects that deliver new functionality and therefore generate new data, and try to get the data early. Try to make it part, a precondition of rolling out the operations project itself. You won't always be successful there because the business may feel that this extra effort has no benefit. So then you need to get into dirty tricks. You need to find a high visibility failure, a report, for example, with a large red area that says data unavailable because we haven't been collecting it the way we should. It has to be a low impact failure because you don't want your client to fail. But sometimes it's the only way to make the business care. Okay, but these are all preconditions. Where do we really start with AI? We start by considering the things that we can do and the things that we should do, because there are things that you can't do. There are things that you can't do, especially if, despite all your efforts, you don't have the data, or if you can't define the objective. What are we trying to optimize, or the question to be answered? Or because all of these things are clear, but there are constraints, business logic constraints, regulatory constraints, or just not enough people available to let you run the initiative. And despite still having a wide range of things you can do, there are things that you can do, but you shouldn't do. Especially if, first of all, you can't measure the impact. You shouldn't embark on any initiative if you can't measure the difference it will make. Because if you can't measure it, you'll persuade nobody that it's made a difference. You shouldn't try something if you can't estimate or mitigate the risk. Remember, a conservative, low risk appetite credit sector, they won't accept an initiative that is likely to break things, and you can't tell them how to fix them once they're broken. And also, extremely important, you shouldn't do things just because you can, if they're not fair or they're not ethical. I'll have more to say about that later on. Another consideration is, again, priorities. You should consider your priorities in trying to do things. You shouldn't just do things because you can and it's allowed. They have to make a difference. So do consider that before choosing an analytics initiative. How do you do all of that? That's a lot of concerns, and you somehow need to structure them and think about them in a consistent way. What we do is we build an analytics scorecard. When I'm talking about analytics scorecard, I'm not talking about something like a risk model or something you apply to the customers. I'm talking about a scorecard about analytics, a structured way of evaluating which analytics initiatives are worth being pursued. And that scorecard needs to look at a number of things. Basically, all of the things that I've discussed so far. Data needs, business needs, constraints, the feasibility of adopting your analysis once it's complete. And for every one of those things, it should ask, how do I measure this? Because if you don't measure it, you'll persuade nobody that you're doing it right. Also, you need to focus on starting with a few sure things. Now, this is important. When you're discussing innovative analytics initiatives, everybody focuses on the blue sky, long-term ambitious initiatives that will fundamentally transform the business. You should not start with those, even though those might be the ones with the highest potential benefit. Why is that? Especially if you're first starting out, these initiatives may take months or years to run, and your priorities will evolve over that period. If 6 months down the road, the priorities have changed, you have committed to a 6-month initiative that is no longer of any worth, and you still don't have any credentials. So do try to start with quick wins, things that would deliver a measurable, small but measurable benefit in the short term that will help you build your credentials and have more clout, more persuasive power in doing the more advanced stuff. The other thing about sure things is that they've probably been tried before, but not in an optimal way, especially if people haven't been doing machine learning and AI and so on. So that gives you a benchmark, and it's usually a benchmark that's fairly easy to beat. Another feather in your cap. If you do that, the business may come back and say, yeah, but that was a sure thing. How is that going to help me going forward? This is where you focus on process, because if you do things right, you're following an analytics process that is repeatable, it's reproducible, and you can then apply it to more and more complex problems. So you can be in a position to say that, see, my approach worked. Let's now try it on that rather more important and rather more ambitious challenge. They won't let you do that if you haven't proven your worth first. Here's an example of the analytics scorecard we used as part of the case study. I'm not going to go through it in detail. Talking of the case study, running through the analytics scorecard turned out to be much easier than you might think. There are a lot of questions in it, a lot of technical details, measuring things and so on. But that was easy. What was hard was getting the right score out of it. And that was because our various sponsors had radically different views of where the value lies. It turns out that what an executive perceives as value and what a line of business person perceives as value may be in conflict. And that is a conflict you need to resolve. Because if you don't, you'll only keep one of them happy, and both of them need to be happy for the initiative to be a success. The way we approached that was by focusing on using the scorecard to eliminate infeasible initiatives. Things that were of no interest to the executive or of no interest to the line of business person, or were infeasible for other reasons. We didn't have the data, whatever. And we also use the scorecard to track the changing discussion, because as these people sit down at the same table and start aligning their priorities, you'll see that those priorities will evolve. And what was a priority to begin with may no longer be a priority by the time you start the analysis. So having a scorecard helps to track that. We also try to use the numbers coming out of the scorecard to promote widely applicable initiatives. There are two reasons for that. One is that widely applicable initiatives are likely to deliver more benefit. If you're affecting a larger slice of the portfolio, you'll see more benefit than if you're only affecting 10 customers. The other reason is that this larger scale leads to more data and less noise. And less noise means clearer messages, clearer results, less exceptionalism, more patterns that everybody can agree on. And that, again, will help you get acceptance of the result of your analysis. Okay, how do we use the results? But wait, you will say. You jumped straight from deciding what analysis I'm going to run to using the results of the analysis. Where is the actual analysis? I'm going to disappoint you here because, as you must have gathered by now, this talk is not about how to run AI. If you've gone through everything that I've discussed so far, you've covered all of the preconditions, you've answered all of the questions, you've got clarity on everything, it should be trivial to run AI or ML or whatever on your data and come up with something usable. I'm not going to discuss that, although I'll be happy to answer more technical questions at the end. For now, I will assume that having solved all of the previous problems, a clever team has gone away with an amazing Qualco product and done some magic to the data and come up with what? A predictive model, an action framework. The thing is that most analytics techniques will at best deliver patterns and predictions. Turning them into actions, that's a separate problem. Remember, there were two gaps in our analytics process. Turning them into actions is still part of the process, but there are very few techniques that will do it for you. There are a few, but we'll see why they're not applicable in our case. And even once you have a framework for determining the right action, how do we apply those actions in production? These are now critical concerns. In the past, if you ran a single analytics initiative every year, you could spend your time on finding answers to these. But if you're trying to achieve the promise of ubiquitous analytics, these are things that have to happen automatically by the process without thinking about them again and again in different ways. And given that there is limited machine support for these things, they can be much harder than actually building the AI that drives your analysis. So what do we recommend? You need to design operationalization into your analysis to begin with. First of all, you need to think about operationalization as part of your analytics. You need to ensure that the business stakeholders are happy with the way you plan to operationalize the analysis and are willing to risk it. But you also need to ensure that the systems running your operations are happy to consume your analysis. If you have a set of actions coming out of your analysis, but no system that can ingest those actions and automatically apply them to your portfolio, then again, you won't get any usable results. You should be prepared to orchestrate test and learn trials. You may even need to run test and learn trials to generate data to run your analysis. And test and learn trials are not easy from an ethical perspective. You need to think really long and hard about how you set them up. And finally, you need to accept that changes to business approaches will be inevitable. No matter what your analysis, it's going to lead to suggestions for action. And those actions will be different to what has been happening in the past. So if you don't change your business practices to adopt those actions, you won't change anything. That is hard for business people to accept, but there's no way around it. So again, it's one of the things that you need to deal with upfront. Finally, something that may look like a technical point, but it's not. You need to measure adoption as well as performance, because your analysis will not optimize your operations unless it is actually used. And no matter what the business says, even at the very last step, at using the actions and applying them to your portfolios, there are failure scenarios. So you need to be able to track those. Okay, back to our case study. In our case study, again, our team went away with our product and built an AI model that essentially told us who the riskiest customers are. Okay, so that covers the predictive analytics part, the from data to predictions part, the easy part. What do we do about those customers? How do we address prescriptive analytics? There are two traditional approaches, and unfortunately, neither works here. The first traditional approach is to look at what's been done in the past. So build another model that uses the correlation of the data about your portfolio and your risk estimates and whatever with the effectiveness of the actions that have been taken in the past and comes up with interesting results. That works if you have historical data. But remember, in our case, uniform treatment, nothing relevant has been done in the past. Every customer has been treated the same way. So your analytics can't really come up with suggestions about which action is most suitable, unless you try to generate data by acting at random on your customers. This is the way the more advanced techniques of prescriptive analytics work. I'm sure all of you have seen the entertaining videos on YouTube about robots trying to learn how to walk using reinforcement learning. The way that works is robots start moving their hands and feet randomly, and eventually they hit upon something that works, and they keep pursuing that. And sooner or later, after a lot of stumbles, a lot of bruised knees, they learn how to walk. Well, looking at a robot doing that is entertaining. Looking at an actual customer falling down, believe me, it's not entertaining, and it's not ethical. You can't just act randomly. You have to treat your customers with respect and with lots of care. We're talking about real people and real livelihoods here. So acting at random is not an option. Ultimately, we had to go for an empirical approach. What does empirical approach mean? It means take the risk estimates coming out of the AI and sit down with business users and define a clear, simple set of action options, matching different risk categories to different suggested actions. And once you do that, you need to A/B test it. You need to try it out on a small slice of your portfolio, see whether it works, and if it does, extend it, or if it doesn't, tweak it and try it again. Always keeping fairness and ethics in mind. That will take a while, and that's a good thing, because it will also take a while to build the report to properly define and measure success. So that's another key takeaway. Reporting is not boring. Reporting is analytics. If you're not reporting on your analytics, you're not doing analytics. The good thing is that it turns out that machine learning or AI or whatever you want to call it is effective, even if its prescriptive framework is empirical. So that's not the problem. AI works even in this, let's say, half-baked approach. One minor issue that crops up here is that the business isn't stupid. Okay, business people may be ignorant, but they're not stupid. And it turns out that the ad hoc approaches that they've been applying, while suboptimal, while not as good as the AI-driven approach, are generally sometimes in the right direction. Let me give you an example. The empirical approach might say that for the high-risk customers, I really need to intensify my contact attempts. I need to talk to them more often, which sounds reasonable. In the past, the business has been using a uniform treatment, but in fact, because the high-risk customers are also the least contactable customers, they tend to concentrate their contact effort on them by default, simply because they can't find them on their phone. Sometimes you'll see that both in your A/B testing, you'll see that your test set and your control set behave in not similarly, but at least in the same direction. And you'll be guessing, why do they, how on earth are they doing the right sort of treatment without access to the predictive analytics? Well, it's because sometimes business is reasonable. On the other hand, sometimes the business is not reasonable. They will second guess and override your suggestions. Yorgos, a high-risk customer? No, I know Yorgos. Yorgos is a low-risk customer. I don't know what you say. I'm going to treat them as if they are low risk. That happens, which is another reason why you really need to measure adoption. Okay, I'm just about out of time, but I'm also out of things to say. Let's quickly recap the things I've tried to make a point of. When you try to do AI or any type of application of the analytics process to solve business problems, you need to be very clear about your approach and your expectations. You need to resist being seduced by the technology. You need to find your sponsors, and you need at least two. You need to decide on how you're going to do analytics in terms of organizational structure and resources. You need to have a data repository and a data roadmap to let your data repository evolve. You need to build a scorecard to evaluate the various analytics initiatives that you have on the table, and you need to choose the simplest and surest ones to begin with. You need to design operationalization into your analysis, and you need to measure adoption as well as performance. Okay, you will note that none of these points are directly related to AI or machine learning or data science or whatever. Okay, this guy is putting us on. He's tricking us. He's not talking about AI. Well, no, I'm not talking about AI. And the truth is that all of these new technologies change few of the things that we can do. What they change is the scale and the scope at which we can do them. AI will help you greatly expand the scale and the scope, but it won't solve the problem on its own. What we need to do is build the right processes around AI, around all of these technical concerns, to make sure that they can scale and they can solve actual problems related to actual business processes. Because as always with technology, it's not about what it can do, it's about how you use it to solve real world problems. And as for our case study, at the bottom line, yes, after going through all of that pain and effort, we observed a consistent 7% improvement in revenue on the slice of the portfolio to which the analysis was being applied, while spending less effort, which is good for the organization running the portfolio, but it's also good for the customers because we bother them less, and also measurably improving rehabilitation rates. In other words, helping customers more, helping them to get out of debt. And that worked fine for a few months, and then COVID hit. And that changed the world fundamentally, but that's a story for another day. Because there is never a bottom line in analytics. One of the interesting things about analytics is that it changes day to day. But if you adopt all of these techniques that I've been talking about, you probably will be able to respond in time. And that's all I had to say.
Thank you, Panayis. Thank you for putting the effort to give a very different perspective from the usual technical account of the use of AI. I think it gave a lot of ideas, at least to me, but I'm sure to many others. And we do have 10 more minutes for discussion, which is good.
Okay, two questions here. Do we consider a multimodal approach that involves heterogeneous data in general? In general, yes, we do, wherever we can. What we actually do is we try to bring all of the data together in a single data repository and structure it. Structured data looks pretty much the same, no matter what it represents, so you can feed it into a uniform analytics initiative. Remember, I mentioned that most of the pain points lie on the first line on data management and ingestion and descriptive analytics. That's part of what that relates to. At the moment, we are using both structured and originally unstructured data, but we all know that unstructured data cannot be used as it is. You first need to structure it. So a lot of the effort goes into doing that. We are experimenting with text-based analytics. We have run a few prototypes, a few proofs of concept, which are very encouraging. It seems that gathering heterogeneous data can make a difference. On the other hand, there's a lot of hype around that area. You've probably heard about people making credit decisions based on Facebook comments and Instagram likes and whatever. Yes, that can be done. But it turns out that the boring traditional stuff, like looking at customers' recent payment history, is much more predictive. So, there is no silver bullet here. But if you have the infrastructure that can scale and consume and consider all of that data, some of the data might surprise you. And that relates to the second part of the question, which has to do with big data, volume, veracity, velocity, and so on. We have an interesting perspective on that. Part of it is what I mentioned earlier, that big data is all about managing volumes of unstructured data, but you still have to structure the data before you do anything with it. So big data will help you with that part of the process, but it will also help you scale up your analytics, but it won't give you magical ways of directly dealing with unstructured data. As for veracity, yes, that is a concern. You need to have the right data, but again, our perspective here is different to the traditional one. In the traditional approach to analytics, you would spend months making sure that all of your data makes sense, just because applying the core algorithmic part of the analysis was so expensive that you couldn't afford to do it twice. With big data and machine learning, what we actually do is we throw all of the structured data at the algorithm. The model that comes out of it may be usable as it is. If it's not, it will highlight the problematic pieces of data. So you have a very simple fix to identifying problematic data rather than trying to solve all of the problems in all of the data before you start the analysis. That's an interesting reversal of the traditional process that can actually make a difference to the duration of the analysis.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Panayis, for that. I'm informed that there are a couple of questions in YouTube, so I will read them out to you because you cannot see them. Mm-hmm. So the first one says, is it trivial to run AI and machine learning on your data?
It is if you have the right processes in place. No matter what the techniques people use, whether it's AI or ML or neural networks or traditional logistic regression, you can do it manually by having a magician manually evaluating every step of the analysis and choosing features and algorithms and so on. And if you ask that magician, they will say that they can't really explain how they're doing it. It's all part of their experience, and they really need to be there and do that manually every time. But the truth is that if you persevere, you will get them to describe their process. And if you can describe a process, you can automate it. And if you can build a product that automates the process, then that magician will no longer need to spend their time on manually moving and evaluating data. That doesn't mean that the magician will be out of a job, because what the magician should really be doing is interpreting the results of the analysis. And they'll have much more time to do that if you automate everything else. So yes, running an automated analysis can be trivial. Building the product that does it is not. But no, this is not an advertisement for Qualco, so I won't tell you exactly what our product does in this area.
Thank you for that. The second question in YouTube says, how do you solve the problem of filling the gap of trial and error until bringing machine learning to production?
That's a good question. In my experience, you don't. You just engage people in discussions that take about 2 to 3 months. They can always afford to run their business suboptimally for 3 months because they've been doing so for much more than 3 years. And in the end, you deliver the optimized approach, and that's it. Many people spend a lot of time on temporary fixes to the day-to-day. And we've seen that happen again and again. No, we can't do AI because we have a critical business problem that we need to do something about this week. And then next week, there's another critical business problem. And all of these critical business problems are problems that wouldn't be there if you had the right optimized approach in place. So sometimes you just need to say, okay, these things keep happening. They have been happening in the past, and we somehow survived them. Let's focus on something that will take a month rather than a week. And that will allow us to optimize things enough that we'll have some breathing space and think about things with fewer swords hanging over our necks.
Okay, thanks. There's another question in the chat. It says, why don't you target at the same time debt reduction, profit making, and risk minimization, differentiating for at different levels depending on the needs of the client?
Okay, my answer here is yes and no. Yes, in the long term, all of these things align. If debt is reduced, it's good for the customer because they won't be owing money. It's good for the bank because they have a clear balance sheet. It's good for everybody. And the risk will be minimal and profits will go up. But that's in the long term. And as we all know, businesses are rarely optimized for the long term. So in the shorter term, you need to choose what at least their perception of their priorities is and try to get everything else to align over the longer term. If you try to target everything in the short term, you'll come up against conflicts. And we all know that, there is a reason why people talk about constraint optimization, where you choose one thing to optimize and everything else to be constrained. Multi-objective optimization is not really a thing. It's not, it can't happen mathematically. You need to make compromises in every direction. And sometimes the answer is to compromise, but then you get into a discussion about which bit to compromise, how far. And that's another variable, another dimension in choosing what analysis you're going to do. So you'll avoid it if you can. If you can't, yes, you will try to model through by building a combined metric and trying to optimize that. But that makes your story less clear. And remember, especially when you're starting out in analytics, it's really important to keep your story clear so that you can build credentials and do more interesting stuff in the future.
So I would like to thank our speaker again. Thank you very much for a very inspirational talk.
Thank you for the opportunity and everybody else for their time.
Thanks a lot also to everybody who attended here and on YouTube. And we'll be back with another talk soon. Thanks. Thank you, Panayis.